Welcome everyone to the Baristas Under Brexit culminating presentation. My name is Nazima Kadir and I am the principal of the October Anthropologist. I just want to make a few preliminary remarks around the principles and the ethos of this project. This is a celebration of migrants and migration, and immigrants and immigration. We are celebrating people who arrive in a country to live and to work. We're celebrating people who show up without understanding and speaking a language and then decide to learn it. But we're also celebrating people who show up, live, and work in a country and they don't speak the language and they never learn it and they decide to stay anyway. We're celebrating people for all of their contributions and not just their cheap labor and their willingness to do things that people with more rights and who feel more entitled refuse to do. We are celebrating their hustle. So in terms of today's agenda, we're going to start out with an introduction and a project overview. We're going to have some music inspired by this project. Then we're just going to go deep into the research and the art pieces created from the research. During that time, we're going to have a couple of songs inspired by the research performed. In terms of questions and answers, we're going to use the Q&A function via Zoom for that. That's at the bottom of the screen. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to type it in, and as we pause, we're going to address the questions and the comments during the presentation. After the larger Q&A, we're going to have a discussion around settled status. Settled status is a bureaucratic process in the UK for European citizens to retain their rights after Brexit. Afterwards, this presentation will be recorded. Right now we are recording the presentation and this will be made publicly available. I'd like to thank the Brent 2020 team, specifically to Tanya, with whom we've worked for nearly a year. I'd like to thank the Brent Biennial team, specifically Amanprit, who's been extremely supportive of us. Neef, who is the owner of Two Doors Down, which is a bar and restaurant in Williston Green. We were originally going to host our live event there, and she subsequently allowed us to use that space for the musical performances and to do some additional filming. Vanessa Minaris and Jihei Kim for being in the film, as well as to all the baristas and the cafe workers who agreed to be interviewed for this project. So I'd like to introduce myself briefly before we get into the content of the project. My name is Nazima Kadir. I'm the principal of the October Anthropologist, and I am an anthropologist, and that means I actually have a PhD in anthropology. I've been doing research for over 20 years, which means that I collect information by talking with people and spending time with people. I'm originally from New York City. My parents were immigrants, and growing up in New York City meant that I was surrounded by people who did not speak English. And it was very, very normal for me to be around people who didn't speak English and to communicate with them. And it never even occurred to me that this was going to be, this was in any way going to be an issue until I was much later in my life when I realized that it was quite rare to be able to perform with people. When I was in my 20s, I was very lucky in that I was able to live and work in lots of different types of spaces. I worked as an investigator of police misconduct for a couple of years in New York City. I lived in Cyprus for a year where I researched labor conditions of Asian domestic workers, and I traveled all over the Middle East. I lived in Latin America for a couple of years, and I spent time in Mexico, Chile, and Cuba. And I lived in Uruguay for a year, so I speak Spanish. And for my PhD, I lived and worked in a squatters community in Amsterdam for about 3 years. Based on that research, I published a book which was shortlisted for the BBC Ethnography Award. I lived in Amsterdam for a total of 6 years, and during that time I learned Dutch. And I say all this because the migrant experience is quite familiar to me. I'm very, very familiar with what it means to live and work in a space when you are unfamiliar with what's going on. So now, going back to the substance of our presentation, this project has been percolating and in my life for quite a few years. So I moved to London about 9 years ago from Amsterdam, and I moved to London and basically I was in a situation where I came to London and didn't quite know what I was going to do and where I was going to work. I was transitioning out of having worked in the public sector and in academia, and I love coffee and I love cafes, and I found myself spending a lot of time in cafes talking to the people who work there. And what I found was that people were highly educated, and that they tended to be from Southern Europe or from Eastern Europe, and they had degrees in biology and in engineering, and they were architects and art historians, and yet they were working as baristas in cafes. And it struck me that they were being underutilized for their education and their skills. And I was curious in terms of what that meant. Like, what did that mean for London? But then what did it mean for them in their lives? And that was something that I was really, really interested in. At the time, I myself was quite lost in many ways. Like, I had a PhD, I was trying to transition to a new sector, and I was sort of curious about my own future, and so I related to them, and I was really curious about them. And I was always curious about what that meant for them. And as an anthropologist, I wanted to look at that anthropologically. And so I was quite interested in this project for years, but like all of us, I was really, really busy, and I didn't have a chance to explore it in a deeper way. I was really lucky in that I was really lucky in a sense that I met people from Brent 2020. Now, so for people who are not familiar with the London Borough of Culture, it is a program in which one of the 32 London boroughs gets to highlight and showcase for a year the cultural production and artistic production in the borough. And Brent 2020 was doing something quite unusual. They were actively soliciting cultural and artistic practitioners who lived and worked in Brent. I met people from the Brent 2020 team, specifically to Tanya. I pitched this project, and she said, great, go for it. And then I was able to win the grant and get it funded. So I think I want to talk a little bit about Brent as a space. This picture is a street in Willesden, approximately 30 seconds from where I live. And I think it's worthwhile thinking about the demographics of Brent. Brent is quite unique in the UK. 55% of the population is born outside of the UK. 65% of the population is not white. We are Black, Asian, or minority ethnic. Of the 35% of the people who are white, 55,000 are EU citizens. Willesden, which this is a picture of, which is where I live, is full of people who are from Italy, Spain, Portugal, as well as people all over the world who have citizenship in one of these countries. So of the people who are white, of the white minority, it's actually quite diverse. And people who are white and born in the UK are really quite a small minority. The reason why I bring this up is that, especially for people who are coming from places that are potentially much more homogeneous, it's quite a lot to have to learn and get used to a very different cultural hierarchy. The other thing I was really interested in terms of this project was this idea of how the London boroughs interact and serve each other. Now, Brent, which is where I live and where I am right now, is a very poor borough. And what that means is potentially housing is slightly cheaper, cost of living is slightly cheaper, And so it's a good place for people who are who are moving to this country to land, because there's a little bit more infrastructure if you don't have a lot of money and you don't have a lot of connections. And you're potentially also interacting with people from your own country. And so I was really interested in this idea of Brent receiving and enabling an infrastructure so that people could work and live and work in more expensive areas. And what was that dynamic like? So as I mentioned, this project received funding from Brent 2020, and that enabled me to work with an amazing team of people. I am over there in the left. That's me in a market in Birmingham. In the middle is the amazing Holly Monahan, who is our producer. And on the right is Marna Shorak, who was a researcher on this project and who project managed all the research. These two women happen to be Americans, but they also happen to have European passports, which I think is kind of funny. So in terms of the research itself, this is what we did. We were really, really curious about the lives and labor histories of Southern and Eastern Europeans working in the cafe culture of London. We were interested in their migration stories and what it means on a more nuanced level to be an immigrant in London today. We were interested in navigating and understanding how they navigated the job market in general and hospitality in particular. And I really wanted to understand what were the discriminatory barriers that prevented this population from using their education and employment skills in London's labor market. And I wanted to understand what were the invisible contributions, what was the impact of their education and their skills in terms of the specialist cafe experience. And finally, I really want to understand how they imagine their lives in London and in the UK with Brexit coming. So we worked with Abäke, who is specifically Patrick Lacey of Abäke, in order to produce a series of visual artifacts. And what that meant was Patrick Lacey immersed himself in the research completely and worked with me and Marna in order to find out what was relevant and important. And then he translated the research into a series of visual artifacts. Throughout this presentation, we highlight bits and bobs of that work, but when we go into the section on research and art, we're going to talk more specifically around those artifacts. We also worked with a couple of musicians, Rudy Rocker and Oscar de Weil, of a band called the Migranti. We talked to them about the research and the findings, and they identified different songs from the 1920s, and which very much related to the themes that we found in our own research. And in these presentations, they will perform them in Italian, Yiddish, and German. And so we're going to start out with the first song. We're going to go to the back room of Two Doors Down, where the Migranti are going to sing their first song.
Hello, audience. This is Oscar de Weil, and I'm Rudy Rocker. Hello from London. We're gonna sing songs that are 100 years old and that talk about migrations and how these migrants fare. So the first one is called Igalioni. It's an Italian song of internal migrants of the south of Italy who came to the north to work in the marble quarries. They had terrible working conditions, but they were organizing. And eventually, because they were working in marble quarries, they had access to a special kind of argument, dynamite. Siamo la sciorma nemica d'una galera infame, qui sfilata morte, mette con lenta fame. Orizzonti limpidi schiude la nostra aurora, urla l'ascolto ignora. Chi no siti si incollano fra fendite carene, siamo magri smonti schiavi, stretti impero catene. Sorge del mar la luna, torna le stelle in cielo, ma sulle nostre luci si svela un funereo velo. Dorme di schiavi adussi, via gemer sul remo, spezziamo queste catene, che via remare moremo. Cose gementi schiavi, questo è mare, mare, meglio morir fra flutti sugli ampeggiar del mare. Remiamo finché la nave si schiante sui frangenti, alte le rosse nere agli silbilar dei venti. Su pietosa coltrice l'onda spumosa e via, ma sorgia un dia su martiri il sole e l'anarchia. Su schiavi allarmi, allarmi, l'onda gorgogli sale, tuoni baleni fulmini sul galeon fatale. Su schiavi allarmi, allarmi, poniamo con braccio forte, ma non giustizia o libertà o morte. Giuriam, giuriam giustizia o libertà o morte.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to talk about the process for doing the research. As I mentioned, we were conducting research with cafe workers from Southern and Eastern Europe. And what that meant was that we had to first find them to get them to participate in the research. So we had an extensive social media strategy in which we were targeting different platforms. And we also offered what we thought was quite a good incentive for people to participate. Most people make in this line of work make between £7.50 and £10 an hour max, and we were offering £40 for an interview of between 1 and 1.5 hours. So we thought we would get more than enough people to participate in research, and what we found was no one responded, and we couldn't really figure out why, but we had to switch our strategies pretty quickly. And I think that for people who are doing research, especially among potentially marginalized groups where trust is an issue, it's really important not to rely on social media and instead to use other methods to reach out to people. So what we did was we did in-person, on-site recruitment. And what did that mean? That meant that myself and Marna actually went into cafes, approached the people working there, we introduced ourselves, we introduced the project, and we asked if they wanted to participate. We learned a lot during this process of recruitment. Initially, our plan was always to recruit during the weekends because that was the only time I was available. And we learned very quickly that the weekends were the worst time to recruit because pre-COVID, weekends, cafes and restaurants in London are bursting, and so people just don't have time to talk to you. Secondly, people work double shifts, so they're exhausted, and it's absolutely the worst time to engage in conversations and set up interviews. We also learned that when someone would say that they were interested, and they would give us their telephone number and their email address, we never ever got follow-up interviews, that the only way to successfully ensure a participation in the interview was that we had to set it up at that moment on site. It was much easier to get men to participate than women. And so once we realized that a lot more guys were volunteering, we had to shift our strategy. We specifically, that meant that, for example, I would specifically approach someone and I would say, listen, I'm doing this project and a lot of guys are volunteering and I really think it's important to interview more women. And the women would always laugh and then they'd say, yeah, sure, I'll be part of your project. We also noticed an interesting dynamic, which is whenever we talked to a cafe worker who happened to be from either London or the UK, and we said, we're interested in interviewing people from the UK, from Europe, they often would say, well, I'm not from Europe, I'm from here. And I don't actually think that was a political thing, but it was an interesting observation that the automatic response was, well, I'm not European. So something happened in the middle of our research, and that was COVID, and that had a massive impact on this project. So there was lockdown, and what that meant was that we couldn't go around entering cafes and recruiting people and setting up interviews because all the cafes were closed. On our project team, we had quite a big impact as well. Our researcher, Marna, had to go to Venezuela to visit her family, and then she couldn't leave because all the borders closed. And because in Venezuela the infrastructure is crumbling, she could no longer even work remotely on the project, which meant that we lost a very important project team member as a result of the borders closing. I got sick, I got COVID, my husband got COVID, and even though for me the physical symptoms, I was sick for about a week, but you know, the trauma of being worried about my husband and also just dealing with everything meant that sort of psychologically and emotionally it had a huge impact on me for about 6 weeks. And just to be super honest, like in terms of being mentally and emotionally productive, I don't really feel like I've been myself up until about a month ago. So it had quite a big impact on us. In terms of the research, it had a big impact as well because the population who we were targeting were leaving London en masse. And this made a lot of sense to me because, as we're going to discuss, a lot of people share rooms. They either share a room with someone else, or at minimum, they're renting a room and living in a flat with strangers. And living in lockdown in London with strangers, sharing bathrooms, sharing common spaces when you're out of work, I don't think is a very nice experience. So a lot of people left London during that period. Luckily, we had already done the majority of our interviews by the time lockdown happened. And then we had a few more interviews that we did online that we had gotten through our recruitment. So I think interestingly enough, with the pandemic, we are seeing a glimpse of what London will look like post-Brexit when this population might not be around, and what is the impact on London with these people gone. We did 13 interviews. We interviewed 6 women and 7 men. We interviewed quite a few people with Italian passports, but as you'll see, there's people who we interviewed a guy who grew up in Romania and has an Italian passport, a woman who grew up in Colombia. We interviewed people from Hungary, Slovenia, France, Greece, Poland, Lebanon, and Lithuania. And what was interesting about this group of people was that they all felt very comfortable speaking English, and they were quite confident speaking English, and they all were very familiar with and understood research projects and art projects. So already they were at a certain level in terms of educational and cultural knowledge. And I want to contrast that with, for example, when I would enter into a cafe, into say a Costa Coffee, and the people did not speak English, and I would introduce myself, and they would say to me over and over again, I will speak to my manager, I will speak to my manager. Like they couldn't really interact with me. And so the people we interviewed had to have, they ended up being very educated and understanding stuff like research and art. So in terms of the interviews themselves, we met with people and we would talk for a little over an hour, hour and a half. We usually met in a cafe. We did not interview people in the cafes where they worked, or like I think the majority were in different cafes that they chose. And we asked a whole set of questions. We were curious about their histories in their countries. We wanted to understand what were their educational backgrounds. We wanted to understand why they came to London. We were curious about their experience searching for work in their fields, how and why they decided to get into hospitality. What were the relationships between staff? I was very curious around hierarchies, around nationalities. We wanted to know if they had a sense of craft and pride in their work. We were curious about their relationship to Brent and to the councils, but also we were curious about how they imagined their futures with Brexit and how it impacted their decisions and what they wanted to do in London and in general. So before we moved on, I think it might be helpful to have a mini Q&A at this point. Holly, are there any questions?
Hello, we don't have any questions from the attendees yet, but I just have an observation just from helping to produce this. It occurred to me that not only when you did this research, you documented a time in London in cafe culture when cafe personnel was mostly these European immigrants. So not only were you, and before Brexit, the implementation of Brexit, so not only did you kind of create documentation of that, but it's really sort of a time capsule of pre-COVID cafe culture that after now, the atmosphere and the communities that you were talking to won't really even exist. The way that cafes are at the moment, if they're even open, are faced with looming lockdowns, everyone wearing masks and hand sanitizers and social distancing. So I just think it was sort of especially remarkable that you really captured this moment of such an important part of everyone's daily lives that was truly an end of an era in more ways than one.
Well, I mean, hopefully the pandemic will be over, and I would be very sad if we were at the end of cafe culture in London and in Europe in general. So hopefully that will be over, but Brexit is coming, right? And Brexit has had a huge impact on whether people decide to migrate here, what are their conditions, why they want to be here. So I think I'm going to be optimistic for a vaccine so that we will have, again, a burgeoning restaurant, cultural life, cafe life here in London. But whether or not this population will be in those roles is another question, because they might not want to actually come, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. In terms of our findings, we have about 2 sets of findings, which I'm going to talk through with 2 different visual artifacts. The first visual artifact we call the cost of coffee, and the second visual artifact we call a journey map. So this is a poster that we call the cost of coffee. Now, this was or is the poster for this project, and it was originally intended to advertise the live event, which obviously this online event is taking the place of. And what it's doing, it is taking the visual language of specialist cafes to transport the findings from the research. So so for people who are unfamiliar, this is a pegboard, a menu pegboard, and these are quite standard in specialist hipster cafes. And the beginning of it starts out with the cost of coffee, the cost of a flat white, the cost of Americano. But then it quickly shifts in terms of the cost of labor. And obviously the average hourly wage for a cafe worker in London is £7.50 an hour. This is in contrast to the London living wage, which is £10.75 but not required. And then we contrast that with how much work people are doing and how much the cafe is making from that hour of work. We quickly shift into talking about housing. And this is really important because London is expensive. And so what we learned was that people were renting rooms, and if they had their own rooms, they were £750 a month, which is very expensive, especially on the salary, which meant that people were sharing rooms. They were sharing rooms with partners or with friends or with strangers. And obviously the less they wanted to spend, the more people that they were sharing rooms with, up to 30 people in a room. And yeah, obviously London is quite expensive in terms of travel, and in terms, especially contrasting with the kind of pre-COVID Ryanair travel that existed. The second part of the poster is around education and contrasting the cost of an education here in the UK and even, for example, the US, with the fact that people who are coming from Southern and Eastern Europe who have degrees are coming debt-free, right? So they're coming educated and without debt. However, there is a cost for them to prove and certify the equivalence of their degree despite EU regulations. And these are spaces with these are multilingual spaces. Like, people are coming from all over different countries. They are fluent in different languages, but not necessarily do they feel confident in English. And yet they're not working with people who are from the UK or who speak English natively. So learning English is not necessarily straightforward. And in that last little quote, there's a quote that says, "You need to always be smiling and mix a good combination of genuine and fake joy." And the reason why we did that is because in these cafes, there's usually a little quote or a little ironic twist. There's some kind of playful thing that's on these pegboards that I guess the baristas put on there. And we wanted to sort of subvert that a bit with a quote that talks about emotional labor of a barista understanding how they're supposed to present themselves, and the awareness of that, and also the cynicism around that we thought was kind of fun and funny. Now, the intent of this piece is to really disrupt the fantasy of the experience of a specialist cafe. And it's sort of thinking about the archetype of the middle class consumer. What we're doing is we're basically disrupting the fantasy that in that interaction with that barista, that person is a specialist and a craftsperson. And in that moment of creating that coffee and serving it, that they love what they're doing, and that through that that they're transferring their love, their passion, their sense of skill and taste in that transaction. And what we're actually saying is, well, actually that experience you middle class consumer are having is actually subsidized. It's subsidized by the low wages of the person working there, but it's also subsidized by 20 years of education paid for by the state and the country that they're coming from. That experience is subsidized by lots of different elements that are invisible. So we've been talking about labor conditions and housing conditions, and I think it's a good chance for us to go to another song where there's another type of immigrant from the 20s, and a song that highlights their housing conditions.
The next song is also a song of immigrants, and it's also more than 100 years old. So this song is in Yiddish, and it's the song of the Russian immigrants who went to the cities of the West, specifically the big Anglo-Saxon cities. So there was a big Russian Yiddish-speaking community in London and another one in New York. So while this was the land of their hopes and their dreams, they found rather harsh working conditions. A little bit like today. This song is called Mein Ruheplatz, my resting place. Ich such mich wo die Myrten grünen, gefind's mich dort nicht mein Schatz. Wo Lebenswelken Bäume schienen, dorten hieß mein Ruheplatz. Dorten hieß mein Ruheplatz. Ich such mich wo die Vögel singen, gefind's mich dorten nicht mein Schatz. Ich bin ein Sklav, wo Ketten klingen, dorten hieß mein Ruheplatz. Dorten hieß mein Ruheplatz. Ich such mich wo von Tannenspritzen, gefind's mich dorten nicht mein Schatz. Ich bin ein Träger, wo Tränen knirschen, dorten hieß mein Ruheplatz. Dorten hieß mein Ruheplatz. Und liebst du mich mit wahrer Liebe, gib du mir mein lieber Schatz. Und heiter auf mein Hart, mein Triebe, und mach mir süß mein Ruheplatz. Und mach mir süß mein Ruheplatz.
Okay, that was amazing. Thank you, gentlemen. We're now going to go back to the research, and we're going to discuss now what we call the journey map, which illustrates the barista's journey. So this is quite a complex and large journey map, and it's a little bit too complex for us to just show it on the screen. So instead, what we've done is chopped up bits and pieces, and we're going to talk through it. But if you want to see the whole journey map with the quotes, it's best to go to the octoberanthropologist.com, and we've highlighted the journey map under the Baristas Under Brexit project. So what we've done is that we are illustrating what we call the journey, the barista's journey, via the metaphor of a coffee grinder. And we thought this was really, in many ways, appropriate because we're using the metaphor of beans from around the world that go through this process of heat and transformation, and whether or not how they transform is in many ways up to the machinery of which they get transformed. And it could be a wonderful experience or it could be a difficult experience, but there is a transformation. So we wanted to talk a little bit about what this type of migration disrupts in terms of the ideal of EU free movement. And just as a caveat, I am completely against Brexit, and what I'm talking about here does not in any way support a Brexiteer's argument. But essentially, the idea of free movement in Europe has a lot of assumptions, and it assumes it's sort of this ideal that there's all these different countries, and especially for young people, they can like go and move to a different country, get a job, get another experience, get education, and they'll go back to their country and they'll bring those experiences with them, and it's sort of this very free moving, very fluid process. And it's problematic because that's not how things work. Like, Europe is actually three different Europes. There is the northwest of Europe, which is rich, countries such as the UK, Germany, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, Austria, the kind of places where younger people come to work. There's the southwest of Europe, which is relative to the rest of the world also quite wealthy. It's Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy. These are places that are marked by long-term youth unemployment. And when I say youth, I mean people under the age of 40. And also, if people are able to get jobs, the ability they are not able to live independently off of their salaries. And then of course there's Eastern Europe, the former Soviet bloc, which has a completely different history to other two, especially since the war. And what we're finding from these interviews in terms of what the labor market looks like is that how people are treated is completely dependent upon where they are from. That these people represent the poverty or the wealth of their country. So a robotics engineer from Germany has a completely different trajectory than a robotics engineer from Romania. They are treated very differently. They have completely different possibilities based entirely of the fact that they're from which country they're from. And as a result, they themselves will have different expectations. So we've found this a lot in our interviews with Eastern Europeans, in which there's quite a lot of negative messages against Eastern Europeans, and people internalize that. And so in our interviews, people would say stuff like, well, I'm not like that, and I'm different from people in my country. And it was a way that they kind of took distance from that negative messaging that is quite prevalent here in the UK. People who are from the northwest of Europe are seen as elites and as contributing to society, while people from the south and Eastern Europe are seen as taking people's jobs. And they're under much more pressure to learn and dominate the language than people from the northwest. The other thing that we're seeing is, in many ways, a very unique type of migration. While economics is a factor for that migration, there are other factors as well. Wanting to have access to education was a huge reason that people were immigrating. Now, and when I say education, I don't just mean formal education via an institution. I'm also talking about having opportunities to meet other people, learn English, have an experience that is not available in their country. In many ways, it's around like the myth or the dream of making it in the big city. And at this moment, London is the big city of Europe. It's the big global capitalist city. It's known as a place with really harsh housing conditions, harsh living conditions, and where it's really like a hard place to live and work. So if you can show up here and you don't know anyone and you don't have any connections, you don't have money, and you can make it work, it's kind of this idea that you can make it work anywhere. The other thing that we're finding is that in contrast to people who are from the global south, these people, when they migrate, the money they earn goes towards themselves. So they're paying for their housing, they're paying all their costs. They're not sending that money home to take care of someone else. And I think that's quite an important distinction, because it really impacts their behavior. They are educated, at least with a BA, if not more, but they don't have educational debt, which also is really important in terms of how it impacts what they do and how they behave and how they imagine their futures. They're not saddled with debt. So, and one more thing, like a lot of times when I've talked to people about this project, they tend to talk about them as being part of a community. They're not part of communities, they're individuals. They are migrating as individuals, not as communities. Now, because they are educated, what came out in the research is that they have a really interesting critical perspective towards the society around them, right? So the way they view the cafes, the way they view the people they work with, the way they view their consumers, the people who come into the cafes, but also the way they view their futures. And what we did with that to illustrate that critical perspective, we chose a number of quotes, and then we made them into what we call the Baristas Toolkit, which is a set of stamps as well as other kind of typical artifacts from a specialist experience as a way to inscribe the barista's voice into these visual artifacts from specialist cafes. In terms of patterns, we were seeing the fact that for a lot of people, they're coming from countries where it's really hard to get a job. And even if they do get a job, it does not enable them to live independently. So upon arrival, a lot of people were quite struck by the fact that it was so easy to get work. And there were two different ways that they got work. And again, this is pre-COVID. They got work through an app called Jobs Today, in which they literally would get a job that day. And this also reflects the fact that there's a massive labor shortage, or there was a massive labor shortage in hospitality, and as a result, it was quite easy to get work. It's the gateway to the labor market, and it's easy to get work there. Or they got work because in the first cafe or the restaurant or hotel, the manager or the people who worked there were almost all from their country, and they were able to get the work through that national connection. At the other hand, while it was really, really easy to get work, they also often found that they quote unquote got stuck because of the low wages. That meant that they were working minimum 40 hours a week, if not 80 hours a week. And it meant it was very hard for them to do the other things that they wanted to do. So people who were working in fashion wanted to be in fashion or in architecture or they wanted to explore other parts of themselves. They were just, their off time was just recovering from working. And yeah, the other issue too was that this sector is quite segregated. Like, they don't work with English people, so they came specifically to improve their English, but in the end they didn't actually have much interaction with English people beyond the English customers in the restaurant or the cafe. And we're about to show this Barista Toolkit in action, which are specifically stamps that we made that are intended to be put on cardboard cups. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to now go into specific artifacts that we have and talk through the stories from which we made these artifacts. So this is a loyalty card, and so for people who are familiar with cafes, loyalty cards are standard. And this highlights a quote that we call a proper job. A proper job is one that doesn't entail serving people, but the job I have now does require skills, patience, stamina, to be standing all day and to put a smile on your face. It is not easy. Now this comes from an interview with a young woman from Hungary. She's been living in the UK for about 3 years. She had a BA in biology in Hungary and was in the middle of a graduate degree for biology. And she just was not happy. She was not happy with the politics and the government in Hungary. She wasn't happy with her life. Her family didn't have much money, so she didn't have any kind of economic incentive to stay there. She wanted to move to another country. She was interested in Germany, in the UK, in the US, and was investigating different options, and then decided to come to the UK because it was closer to Hungary, but also for the access to English language and potentially for further to get another degree. She came here, immediately got a job in hospitality. I think her first job, everyone in the restaurant was from Hungary. She then had like a series of different jobs in hospitality, and after like a couple of years working double shifts, she decided that she wanted a little bit of a change, and then started a master's degree in biology in an extremely prestigious university here in London. Was working full-time, 40 hours a week in a cafe, and then also working as also in her university, doing her degree. Worked her butt off, worked extremely hard, finished her degree, and found herself unemployed. She applied for tons of jobs, and she did her best, got some interviews, and didn't find anything. And when I asked her about that, she immediately blamed herself. She believed that she didn't stick to it enough, that she wasn't confident enough. And I was quite struck by this because as someone who's not from here, but also had to come and get jobs and network and do all this stuff, I learned pretty quickly that the ability to get jobs is much more about who you know than about really working hard in school. And one of the things that she really believed that by working hard, this would give her access to the labor market that she wanted, while actually she needed to be networking in her program. She was very shy and very introverted, and she just didn't like to have to network. And so anyway, so I thought it was really, really interesting. And what I love about this quote is that she is in many ways speaking to this discourse around unskilled labor, that this idea that her job is implicitly unskilled. And she's saying actually it does require a lot of skills. Like, you know, not only does it require like social skills with dealing with potentially very difficult people, but you have to work a lot and to be standing and to put a smile on her face. And for her, that was quite hard because she was an introvert. And a lot of her bosses are constantly telling her to smile, which is painful for her, you know. So I quite like that. This is a stamp. This is a quote that we put on a stamp, and it's called "There Love in the Coffee." And the quote is, "There is no love in the coffee that I try elsewhere. Love in the coffee means passion. I know the beans, where they come from, how to steam the milk, and I find it difficult to put in words. You need to experience it yourself." So this is from a young man from Slovenia. He's been living in the UK for about 10 years, and he had a little bit of a similar story to the woman who we interviewed from Hungary. You know, he was from a poor family. He'd been working since he was a teenager, and he decided that, you know, he wanted something different. He wanted to move somewhere else. He wanted to have access to other opportunities. He was thinking about Germany. He was thinking about the US. He was thinking about Australia, and the UK made sense in terms of language, but also just in terms of distance from his home country. He showed up here. He got a job working at a hotel for a couple of months. You know, at a certain point, he was living in a hostel, sharing a room with 30 people. He had 60 pounds in his pocket. He wasn't sure if he should use that money to go back to Slovenia or try to find another job in London. He was able to get through contacts in the Slovenian community. He was able to couch surf for a while. And then he got this job in this cafe where we met him, where he'd been working for 7 years. And he had a really unique passion for coffee and the craft, and he understood the beans. But he was always very quite critical of Londoners and Londoners' inability to stop and enjoy themselves and savor and really get into this product that he put so much passion into. Meanwhile, you know, I think he makes about 10 pounds an hour, works double shifts. He's got a kid, he's got a wife, his wife is working full time, they have an infant child, and they're trying to make it work in quite tough conditions. Meanwhile, he has so much passion for what he does and the product, which I found super interesting. This is a concept for a coffee lid. And it's coming from a quote from an interview around working and sleeping. And this is from a young woman from Lithuania. She had a couple of stints of working in the UK. She has a degree as a nutritionist, so that she's qualified to work in a hospital in Lithuania. For her to work in a hospital, the wages are so far below the cost of living that it doesn't even make sense for her to even work in her field. In Lithuania, it makes sense for her to work in hospitality because she earns more than as a qualified professional. She then she arrived in the UK and was living in a hotel and working in a hotel with her boyfriend, sharing a room. And that situation was both great. It was lucrative because all of her expenses were taken care of. They docked some money for her room, but otherwise most of the money she was able to keep and save. And then she's since been living in London, working double shifts, again, working 40 hours at a hotel as a barista and working in a cafe where we met her as a barista. And she's just basically just saving up money in order to get her degree as a nutritionist translated and certified so that will enable her to work in a British hospital. And for her, like, it's just about trying to live and work in her field, trying to work in her field and letting that be her only job. And she wants to try that out and see if she can actually make it work. She was really struggling when we met her. She was telling us about what it was like for her in London and the loneliness of living in London and what it's like to have a job where you're working 80 hours a week and you're only sleeping and you don't really get a chance to enjoy this incredible city. And she actually said to me, like, how long did it take for you to feel good here? And I had to be honest with her, and I said, you know, it actually took me like 2 or 3 years. Like, it wasn't easy. I had to learn how to live here. And this is a quote from a Greek barista who is very, very funny. The quote is, "I taught some of my customers to say thank you and greet. One man comes in every day. I always smile and say good morning, and he always replies, double espresso." And this is made into a stamp. And what I like about this is that, again, it's about this contradictory and double perspective. So you can see this and you can think, okay, this is about, on one level, about, you know, you're a cafe worker, you're a barista, you're making coffee and food for someone, and you see them every single day, and you're giving them nourishment, you're providing for them, and you get this rejection. You're treated like this machine. On another level, and we found this in quite a few of our interviews, the key word here is I taught. And a few people talk about teaching their customers how to enjoy, teaching their customers how to be friendly, teaching them how to actually drink and savor the coffee, and this idea that they will civilize them, that they will civilize these Londoners who are not able to even enjoy a moment because they're so stressed out and all they want to do is drink coffee and work all the time, right? And I thought that was quite clever. So this is an artifact that we call the pube. And what it is this idea that, like, we have, that we were just imagining you're a cafe worker and you're in a specialist cafe. There's this assumption of 60 people. You know, you're supposed to be making 60 coffees an hour. It's London. It's a difficult day. You're tired. You're dealing with horrible people, and you want to be able to express yourself. You want to be able to show, like, your frustration. Normal ways that people in hospitality do that is they pee or they spit in a cup. And in this case, you know, we thought, hey, why don't we just give you a way to express your frustration? And we made a little stamp that looks like a pubic hair. So the idea is that someone can stamp their frustration onto the cup, maybe even hidden underneath, as a way to, and this is part of our little, this is our little, like, barista toolkit. And the last thing I wanted to talk about before we go into our extensive Q&A, we asked questions about Brexit and about what Brexit would look like for these folks, how it would impact them. And we had 2 sets of answers that these 2 quotes illustrate. The first is, now with Brexit, they might employ a robot because no English people will do that work. And the second quote is, they have a lot of categories now. I'm not sure what to fill out. Am I a migrant worker? I had previously applied as an EU citizen, as an EU student. Now the first quote was a sentiment that we saw for different people. And one of the things that was interesting was that people didn't seem particularly bothered by Brexit, which was a surprise. Like, they weren't like, oh my God, I'm so stressed out, or what is this going to mean for me, and what does this mean for my ability to work, and oh my right, like, they didn't seem disturbed by it. And I think, and based on this quote, which we heard a version of in different interviews, I think for a lot of these people, they work a lot and they're not getting paid very much, and they don't think that they're under threat to have other people do that work. They think that, you know, not a lot of people are willing to do it, and are certainly not willing to do it well and long term. And so they don't feel particularly threatened by Brexit, because they're like, who's going to do this? Like, who's going to do this kind of work? And so, and so that was one set of responses. The other responses were illustrated by the second quote. And this is about, in many ways, about the disconnect between the people who are making policy and the people who are living policy. So this is a young woman. She came in to the UK officially, in whatever paperwork, she was officially an EU student. And now, since Brexit, and now with all the legal mechanisms around Brexit, she's now considered a migrant worker. And she understands that that has a negative connotation, is to be a migrant worker. So she's kind of speaking to that, like, you know, the absurdity of that. But she's also speaking about, I mean, there are other things that we found was just that, you know, there's quite, in terms of what's going to happen in Brexit with free movement, you know, for example, there's going to be a minimum wage of $25,000 per year. This young woman, when we talked about that, she was like, I don't know anyone who makes £25,000 a year. And this sort of reflects the larger segregation that we're talking about. Like, when you get into this industry with the low wages and the kind of people you end up spending time with, like, everyone is sort of living just to pay rent. They're not making much money. And this idea that you have to earn this minimum, that just seems completely ridiculous, because they're earning so much less, and they're in a world where everyone is earning around the same amount of money. And it just shows that, like, Brexit as sort of something really absurd, because it's so in contrast to their lives. They don't feel like they're taking jobs away from English people, because there are no English people around who they work with, and they don't see lots of English people trying to get these jobs. In fact, a few times people have said, you know, there's no way an English person would take the amount that we take, or would get paid for 7 hours and work for 12. Like, there's no way that would happen. So they recognize that they're taking on a lot of labor exploitation that they wouldn't if they felt more entitled. So I guess let's just move on to the official Q&A, if people are up for that, and we can just have a discussion.
We do have some great questions, but we have one here from Vanessa.
Great.
London was the land of opportunity for Europeans in the 90s. I'm French with Italian friends who moved here years ago. This is sad that these young, educated Europeans were locked into a job that wasn't what they were trained for. It will probably be worse now with the crisis.
I almost wish that we could put Vanessa. I would love to hear Vanessa's thoughts on this, because it's more of a comment than
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Vanessa, do you want to type in the Q&A if you would like to be on screen or on audio? And I can do that. In the meantime, let me read another. This is a comment from Shelley. As a parent of 4, the only place I could relax was a place with child facilities. Coffee culture is for adults. And another comment. This is from Maria. Is there a lot of research on coffee baristas in the UK or elsewhere in the world?
I didn't see much, I have to say. I was sort of surprised when I did like a casual search around looking at specifically around cafes and cafe culture. I mean, there is stuff around hotel workers and hospitality workers. But yeah, in terms of, I mean, the thing is, one of the things about this project is also around the interactions. It's not just around hospitality and hotels, but it's also around like this idea that people are coming in highly educated, and that is sort of utilized but not recognized, right? Like, why does a middle class consumer need to enter a cafe and interact with someone who they feel is their equal? Like, what is it about that? Like, and what is the history that leads to that? Like, and you know what I mean? I mean, this is something that I'm quite, so it's not just around, it's more than just hospitality workers. I think Vanessa is unmuted, right?
Yes, Vanessa, hello, there she is.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this research is interesting because it made me reflect on my own experience of London. So I'm probably older than many of you. So I arrived here in 97. And so many Europeans were going to London. It was the cool Britannia time. So some were going into proper jobs like I did. So me and my husband now, we found a job before coming here. So we never went into this barista issue. But I have friends who came as barista because there was no job. In Italy, in particular, southern Italy, there was absolutely no job, and the pay was very, very bad. But it's really interesting to see some manage to go up the ladder, and it was the land of opportunity, like you can imagine what New York was maybe a century ago. But it's very sad when I've read this research that these people with great talent, good degrees, that they were never able to actually go up. Something that was supposed to be temporary became permanent. And I can see that it's probably going to be even worse because those jobs are going to disappear. I have a friend who has a restaurant, and he had a lot of Italians and French, but they all came back to their own country. They couldn't stay in the UK because there was nothing was happening with COVID. So I think it's a change of era in many ways.
Any other questions and comments? I see 29 little bits, which is kind of cool. With 30 now, so.
Do.
Yeah.
Yes. So here's one from Janet. Did anyone regret their decision to come to London? And if so, why?
I have a feeling that the young woman I was talking to about the Lithuanian was unsure. And I think one of the interesting things about this research is that we interviewed people with a range of what you would call tenures, right? Like people who'd been here for 10 years, people who'd been here for 1 year, people who got here 6 months ago. So they had they were coming from a range of experiences. And so there are people who are here who are trying it out to see if it's going to work, people who are here and they're settled and making it work long term. And I think that the people who are probably here in the first couple of years or first 3 years, they're probably always wondering if they should go back, right? And they're probably always wondering if it's going to work. I think that, so yeah, like I think that when that young woman said to me, like, how long did it take for you to feel good here? What she was saying here, I don't feel good here. And I'm kind of betting with my time and my energy that this is going to work out. Please tell me that this is going to work out, right? Yeah, but I think it's quite a big bet, isn't it? Like you know, like especially if you're working 80 hours a week, like when does it become worth it? When does it become worth it? Like for some people, it's worth it to work 80 hours a week and to be independent versus not, right?
We have another comment here, a very valid question from Debbie. Could you explain the graphic that we're looking at now?
So this is from...
Thank you for asking.
Yeah. So this is from the journey map. And the journey map, as I said, is quite complex and has got different elements. And what Patrick was doing here was he's using these elements from a coffee grinder as a way to talk about baristas' experiences. And this little graphic with taste and tongue is about what we were seeing in terms of how people imagine their sense of taste and their sense of craft and how they had to teach others around it, and also around them consuming, as in teaching people how to consume, but also them being consumed potentially, right? Like, if you're a human being, you can go through this process and you can become a beautiful flat white with some hearts, or you could be something that gets thrown away, right? And it's a risk. Like when you go through a machine, how you get transformed is, you can't predict it, right? That little bit here was around excretion / waste. Obviously, these machines create a lot of waste, but like this is obviously a metaphor, so it's not like directly, there's not direct points of this journey, but obviously like when you have human potential and so much investment in human beings, and they're coming from wealthy countries, like how are they being quote unquote utilized, and how are they self-actualizing and what is the waste that gets produced when that doesn't happen and who's responsible for that. And that little bit there on the corner is around, like, you know, when you see a coffee grinder, there's a lot of steam and pressure, and there are bits and pieces of that graphic which is around like transformation and how people react under pressure. And there's a lot of stories of physical violence or people getting thrown out, or there's lots of different stories that relate to that. Okay.
So we have a question from Matthew. Developing the idea of teaching, did you observe an element of exchange of cultures, and in which direction was this?
I think that's a really great question, actually. I think that when people talked about teaching, it was a bit as a way of asserting themselves. It was a bit of their way of saying, like, my interpretation of that, of those comments around teaching, because we had a few of them, was that people who we were interviewing either recognized or were afraid that they were invisible, that they were this someone would interact with them every day, and yes, they would see them serving them the coffee, but they wouldn't really see them as whole human beings, and that it was their way of asserting who they were beyond being a barista. It was their way of saying, like, you know, I'm more than this, you know, like, I have influence on you. When I interact with you, I'm more than just this person that hands you that cup, but I'm actually transforming you some way, right? It's about inverting that power dynamic in some ways.
Shelley asks, of your participants, how many are still here?
I don't know, and actually, in some ways, Holly might be better to answer that question.
I have a little bit of a sense because I've been throughout this project since I joined. I've reached out to them a few times to ask them questions, ask them if they wanted to participate further, and it's been surprising how few of them have responded after having, you know, this 90-minute interview with Nazima and being involved. But I was reaching out to them through WhatsApp, which is, you may be familiar. It's an app. It's sort of a main way a lot of people use to communicate, especially younger people. And a lot of the messages I was sending, I could see maybe half of them weren't ever seen or opened, which would mean perhaps that they do not have that phone number anymore. They don't have their London number anymore. So we don't have exact numbers, but I would guess that out of the 13, that maybe at least 5 no longer have their London number, which I think means they left London.
We invited everyone to this presentation at least a couple of times, and we were hoping they would come. So I'm not really sure. It's possible that people on this call are participated in the research, but you know, there was an exodus from London for good reason, and the question is whether or not they came back. One of the there's a cafe here in Williston Green called La Bottega Diana, which is an Italian cafe, and we talked to the owner the other day about the impact of COVID on his business, and he said the big impact is that his clientele was almost entirely Italian, and about 50% of the Italians went back to Italy. So he's had to figure out a way to get people who are not Italian into that cafe, and all of his staff left. They just left. They were just like, you know, I don't want to be here anymore. They left the UK, and he's had to kind of restart both with staff and with his whole business model.
Janet asks, she's curious what surprised these baristas most about what life turned out to be like in London.
You know, no one talked about what their perception was. I mean, there was a couple of people who talked, like a couple of people had 2 or 3 people had a relationship with London before they immigrated officially, like where they had like a fantasy of like, oh, you know, I've always loved London, and I've always loved, you know, I used to come and visit and hang out here before I moved here.
Also, just let me interject another related question from Nanette. How many of them had friends who migrated before them and let them know about what they were in for? What were their preconceptions? Did their friends lead them astray, or did most of the people seem not to really know what life would be like for them here?
Well, so this woman who I talked about earlier, this Hungarian woman, one factor for her to come to London was that she had people here already. and that things were set up in terms of renting an apartment. They were living in a flat share, and they said, hey, you have a room here. They got here, and then it turned out that they were being ripped off by their friends, and they were like, yeah, not so great, and they ended up moving apartments. And I heard that story a couple of times of, I knew someone here already, and they actually helped set me up, but then it turned out they were ripping me off. Honestly, I didn't ask them what their perceptions of life would be like before versus what they have actually encountered. I didn't ask them that question. And maybe I should have, but also I wonder if I have a feeling that if it was really so bad, they would have left. They would have said, screw this and gone, So there's something more that they're trying to achieve while they're here.
I think that is most of the questions we have for now. We will have another short Q&A at the very, very end. And we want to move on to, we have a couple segments. We have settlement status. We have a song. Which would you like to do next?
So we're going to do the next song, which is a London song.
This last song is about the societies all these migrants will encounter in their place of destination. It takes place in London, in Soho to be exact. It's from Brecht's Three Penny Opera, and it's the Ballad of Mac the Knife. And thus this is a song from migrants for migrants. It's of course not in English, but in German, like the original. Und der Haifisch, der hat Zähne, und die trägt im Gesicht. Und der Mackie hat ein Messer, doch das Messer sieht man nicht. Und der Haifischflossen, rot wenn dieser Blut vergießt. Doch der Mackie trägt den Handschuh, auf dem man keine Untat liest. An dem schönen blauen Sonntag liegt ein toter Mann am Strand. Um die Ecke geht ein Mensch, den man Mackie Messer nennt. Und Schmulmeier bleibt verschwunden, und so mancher reiche Mann. Und sein Geld hat Mackie Messer, dem man nichts beweisen kann. Jenny Tauler war gefunden mit nem Messer in der Brust, und am Kai geht Mackie Messer, der von dem allen nichts gewusst. Und das große Feuer in Soho, 7 Kinder und ein Kreis, in der Menge Mackie Messer, den niemand fragt und der nichts weiß. Und die Minder der Gewitwe, deren Namen niemand weiß, wachte auf und ward geschändet. Mackie war ein Preis, und die einen stehen im Dunkeln, die anderen stehen im Licht. Doch man sieht nur die im Lichte, die im Dunkeln sieht man nicht.
We're going to do a short thing on settled status. Amazingly, our singer, Rudy Rocker, ran all the way from two doors down in here in order to come here to tell us about his experience with EU settled status. So there are three questions for you, Rudy. What is settled status? Why did you get it? And how did you get it?
Yay, hello.
What is settled status?
So, settled status is the immigration status that EU citizens that have been resident in the United Kingdom for 5 years can get after Brexit.
All right. Why did you personally, as a European, decide to get settled status?
Well, it's because with Brexit, my rights as an EU citizen to reside within an EU country would actually end. So it was very important for me to be able to keep access to the labour market, access to the welfare state, which mainly is the NHS in this country, and of course the right not to be deported.
Okay. How did you get it?
Yeah, that's a more complicated story. So settled status proper I got in a very easy way. I got it by using the settled status app that the government provided. Actually, I tried to use the settled status app that the government provided by installing it on my phone, and of course it didn't work. But luckily Brent Council, a big sponsor, provided a service where for £12 they would use the settled status app on their mobile phone and do it for me. So I went to the consul and I had to bring my passport. The settled status app would read via an RFID reader the chip on my passport that contains my biometric data. It would then make a photo of me, and then I had to fill in a number of questions, and this was the application. And a couple of months or a couple of days later, actually went quite quick, I got a confirmation that it worked out all right. What needs to be said here is that there is normally let's say the precondition for having settled status is to having lived in the United Kingdom for 5 years. So I had to prove this earlier because my spouse is not an EU citizen. So after we were here together for 5 years, she had to renew her residence permit. And I had to prove that I was here legally for 5 years and earning reasonable wages. So this was then done by sending paperwork of about 120 pages, including utility bills, letters I have received from the government, and of course tax information. But yeah, so last thing that needs to be said, I never received a piece of plastic or any form of confirmation. Settled status for EU citizen is linked to the passport, the physical passport the EU citizen applies to at that moment. And so if I would now have to prove that I have settled status to a potential employer or to a landlord that wants to rent to me, I would go about this in the following way. I would go to the website of the government for settled status. I would type in my passport number. Then that website would send me alternatively to my email address that I gave in the process or my mobile phone number that I gave in the process, a confirmation code that I would then type in the website, and then the website will display that I indeed have settled status with the lousy photo that was made on that day.
All right. So the reason why we have this section was that in the interviews there was a lot of confusion and not any understanding for these people around what Brexit meant for them, and we wanted to just talk about one person's experience getting settled status. Just to be clear, the UK has very strict laws around giving advice around immigration issues. We're not giving advice. We're talking to one European immigrant about his experience getting settled status and why he got it. Does anyone have any questions around settled status and what you need to get it and why and all this stuff that we can ask, and he can talk about his experience? I don't see anything.
It might take a minute for people to ask. There are a couple other new questions that came in about the the project, though, if you'd like to answer
Yeah.
those.
Go for it. What are they?
Actually, we do have one. Elise, thank you. What is reasonable income according to British legislation?
As far as I know, and I will rely on Rudy and as well as Vanessa to potentially help me with this, I believe that you have to earn £25,000 after Brexit in order to live and work here. Is that correct?
Yeah, this is like a complicated affair. So when you were a EU citizen and you would move to Britain before Brexit, you would have to be economically active. There was no minimum limit, which means that you would basically contribute national insurance. You could also be economically inactive, but then you would have to you would have to pay for private health insurance, which is also like a complicated story. It's not like US private health insurance. It's a co-payment that you would make to the NHS. So this has changed now. There was also never a limit as an EU citizen that you needed to have in order to bring your spouse along, nor was the income of the spouse counted into all this. As far as I understand, for people that would come now that do not have older rights for settled status, they would have an income, or the threshold discussed how you could actually apply from the outside to a job in the United Kingdom, so that then you would get a permit to actually work in that job. At this point would be £25,000 a year.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, in some ways, settled status, or at least, I mean, it seems kind of simple. You get pre-settled status, and it seems kind of simple with this app. But I think what Rudy is talking about here is that there's a lot of complexity, and whether or not it gets enforced depends a lot on the larger political situation. And so, like, I myself think it's important, in my experience, because I'm not giving any advice, that right now there is this open window to get legalized, and I think it's really good that you as a European got legalized now while there's flexibility, because I would imagine that things are really shifting in terms of that flexibility, right? So should we so we can continue with settled status, or we're going to ask other questions, you know?
Vanessa had a comment. She says, I'm a UK citizen now, but without a permanent job. It is really hard to get. Same for settled status. Thanks, Vanessa.
Is that true for settled status, or is that true for being a citizen? Because, I mean, Vanessa, actually, would you mind talking a little bit about what you went through for citizenship?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
So again, and I would reinforce the point you made before, I'm not an expert. So it's really my own experience. So I wouldn't, because if you don't hire someone who is an expert, you don't really understand. To become a citizen, you need to be a permanent resident or settled status anyway. So it's the first step you have to do is to have a residency permit. And yes, you have to go through a lot of questions about your insurance, but they really want to make sure that you have a job. So I was never asked how much I've earned. They probably checked how much I've earned. So I'm above the kind of 25,000. So they will check whether you have insurance, whether you have income, and if you have been for 5 years, in the country, and you are allowed. There were moments where I didn't work, so I was a student. So they asked me to have a proof that I was a student. So if you have been that for 5 years, you can show that you are independent economically and that you have insurance. Then you get to settled status. Then you wait for 1 year, and then you can apply for citizenship. And the reason why I applied for citizenship is that what I'm not sure is that, imagine I'm going back to a European country for 1 year, for whatever reason, or 2 years, I would lose my status. So I wouldn't be able to go back. Same thing also, if any of you have got children, when you are a European student, you used to pay the same fees for university as British citizen, which is, lower, but they're going to move that. So European student will pay as much as Asian or Americans, which is very, very high. So the nationality and the status is very important for all these aspects.
Yeah, I mean, like this is quite a confusing period, not just because of the pandemic, but because with Brexit coming, no one I mean, I have no idea what's going to happen. And I think that, like, we thought this little bit around legality was a good point to have, because it is quite confusing. And I think a lot of people are scared of bureaucracy. And like here in Wilson, for example, there's like storefronts that say, we will make you we will get you UK residency, we will get you UK status. And like, I mean, for me to get my settled status took me 5 minutes, right? Like, so, I mean, it would make me sad if someone could do something that takes 5 minutes and they end up paying someone hundreds of pounds, you know? So I would like,
There is a number of things that I noticed in the process. I'm a migrant, and this is not my first migration. So the first country I migrated to has a registration system. So the UK does not have a registration system. So in order to prove my residence, for example, in countries like Germany or the Netherlands or France, the state would have that proof. They would have me registered with them at their address. In the UK, there is no such things. So, as you all know, British or migrant, if you apply for a bank account or anything here, or even if you want to inscribe yourself as at an NHS practice, you always have to bring silly little letters that prove that you live at a certain address. So, you bring your electricity bill, for example, or you bring your rental contract. But there is no way that you can actually, that the government keeps track of where you actually are, which is a liberty right, but it also creates insecurity. The second thing I noticed is, I think that for me it was relatively easy because I have paid taxes for each and every day that I've lived in the United Kingdom. So they just had to, I remember in the process, one of the questions was, do you allow the government to look at your tax records? And I said yes. And from that moment on, I think they had all the data they needed.
Okay, we have about 10 more minutes before we end. What were you going to say, Holly?
I was just going to say, we have a question from Amanprit, which I think Rudy just kind of answered. He said, did it feel like an easy process? He said for him, because of his experience it was. And did the process put you off wanting to come to London?
Look, I'm from a big European city that had its best days and that was best during its decline. So I think that London will actually lose its status and it will be a long line of decline. But I think that's when the best culture is produced. I think that London will be a good place for the next couple of years because it stops being the capital of the world. It makes me very sad, but the process is gonna outlive me. So I'm gonna see a wonderful fin de siècle here.
I think the thing, like, and I'm just gonna riff off of Amanprit's question here. For me, Brexit was really upsetting, like in terms of my motivation and my excitement about my feelings about larger British society, but also just, you know, what kind of London. I mean, London is amazing because there's all these amazing people around, and there's so much unpredictability, and people bring so much with them. And like when I started, they don't just bring cheap labor, they bring a million different things with them that makes it into a vibrant, wonderful place. And Brexit feels like such a slap in the face of all of that. So, you know, it's not easy. It's not this situation, Brexit Trump situation, is not great. All right, so we have about 7 more minutes. Holly, what should we do?
I would like to ask you, I think we have one question here. I think we've gotten to everyone's comments and questions. If we did not, I apologize. We have one last one here from Janet, which I think would be a fantastic one to wrap up with. She asked, Nazima, what most resonated with you from your experience of being and working in a foreign country?
You know, I think when I do interviews with people, what I'm doing is trying to connect with them. That's what I'm trying to do, like as an interviewer, as an anthropologist. I'm trying to get inside, when they're talking, I ask questions to try to understand their perspective and in a weird way, get inside their heads, right? And it becomes easier when what they say somehow connects with my experience. So in many ways, the majority of people were saying things that connected and resonated with my experiences in general. So whether it is from living and working in the UK or living and working in other places. I think in general, as an anthropologist, the anthropological framework is to be highly alienated from your environment. And so I always connect to people who feel really alienated from their environment. So having people tell me these stories are always kind of like, okay, what's a different like lens of alienation in some ways. So yeah, I don't know. I think I always feel like a foreigner, and I always feel as though I don't quite belong. So, just when I hear these stories, it's just a different nuance of that general sense of alienation that I always have.
I think the homeland is overrated anyway. People living in cities have always been migrants. And this is how London became a great city, and that's how all the great cities in the world are. I never moved to Britain, I moved to London.
So I'm going to share my screen again for two reasons. First, because once again, it's quite strict around what one is allowed to talk about in terms of immigration. We're allowed to share stories, and we share the story of Rudy Rocker, and we're allowed to share resources. So on the bottom of the screen, there is a good website about applying for settled status and how to do so. So if you have any questions, just cut and paste that or take a screenshot or whatever. And then moving on to our last slide, I want to thank you very much for coming and participating and being such active participants in this webinar. This is the Baristas Under Brexit project. It's part of Brent 2020. Check out the website. There's a lot happening in Brent 2020. This project is also part of the inaugural Brent Biennial, which is a showcase of visual art in Brent that started in 19 September and goes until 13 December. If you go to Brent 2020 website, they will show you what's going on. There's a wonderful art walk. There's lots happening here in Brent. If you want to look at our artifacts, go ahead and check out the October Anthropologist site, and we are in the process of putting them on the Brent 2020 site as well. Otherwise, yeah, thank you so much for everything and for participating. Thank you very much for being such wonderful and active participants.